Okay, year nine. I've done a recorded lesson today after the issues with Zoom the other day, so hopefully this will be on YouTube for you to watch. As I go through, I need you to obviously make any notes that I ask you to make and complete any tasks that I ask you to do. If at any stage you do want to pause the video, you can do. Your title today is there at the top, the development of cattle ranching in the West. So if you can pause the video, write that and the date and underline both, please, that would be great. So, as mentioned before, this is often seen as the most boring part of the course, and I can understand why. It's basically about how people sold cows and made money off cows in the West. There's a lot of dates, there's a lot of names, and there's a lot of places you've got to get to grips with for it to make sense. So, you're going to need to just grind through this. It's a really important part of the course, and you do need to know about it. This is a sort of topic I would recommend you make flashcards for and start, trying to go back and recover the knowledge as often as possible, because it's not something you want to forget entirely. And then, when we do our exam on this in February, have to recap or revise it all from scratch. So, today, we have 4 objectives. You're going to know the key terms related to the development of the cattle industry. You're going to describe the individual roles of 4 people. Now, 2 of them come as a pair, but you've got Joseph McCoy, you've then got Goodnight and Lovin, who are the pair, and finally, you have John Iliffe. And you have to know what they did to make the cattle industry increase. You then need to, if you're pushing for a grade 6 or 7, you should know your target grades. It should be in the front of your book. So if you're a 4 to 5 grade, you just need to know what they all did. If you're a 6 to 7, you need to draw the links between them and understand how one made the other happen and how that made it develop. Finally, if you're really pushing for that top end, which some of you should be, you're going to write a narrative account for me, analysing why the cattle industry grows throughout the sort of 1860s. So, your first task, there are some key terms. There are 4 key people, 7 key places, and 11 key terms, which you're going to need to know if you're going to understand this topic. I'm going to give you a minute, and I need you to try and remember as many of these as you can. After the minute, they will disappear. I then want you in the back of your books to write down as many as you can remember. We will do this task again at the end to see how much your knowledge has improved over the course of this video. So in in a second, I'm going to give you a minute to remember as many of these. They'll then disappear, and in the back of your books, I want you to remember as many as you can. So 3, 2, 1, start remembering. You've got a minute. Just try and commit as many as you can to knowledge. Don't write them down. See how many names you can start to remember, or how many terms or places. You've had 20 seconds. That's 40 seconds, 20 to go. Ten seconds left. 3, 2, and 1. So stop trying to remember for now, and they've now disappeared. I want you to pause the video. Don't go back and look at them, because what's the point? You might as well have not bothered. And try and remember and write down in the back of your book as many as you can, and then we will count up how many you've got. Do it again at the end and see how much we've improved. So do that now for me. Pause the video, go write down as much as you know. All right. So we'll come back to those, but just to remind, those were the ones you should have tried to get. Anyway. So, we need to do some background. Now, before we start, I want you to look at this map, which I'm pointing to in the bottom left of my screen. It's a map of America. Now, you do need to know, there's some key states you sort of need to know. You need to know where Texas is at the bottom, that's why it's highlighted. The other states you sort of need to know are Colorado and Wyoming up here, Kansas over here, and then in this area you have Chicago, New York, and you also have Philadelphia. So New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and Wyoming. They're the ones we're going to discuss today. And I'd like you to sort of be constantly referencing that map. You may want to get an American map up on your iPads at some point so you can, when I'm talking about places, you know what I'm referring to. So, as we've discussed, the Civil War of 1861 to 65 changed America and the American West quite a lot. It led to the Homestead Act, it led to the Railroad Act, it led to lawlessness, and it led to a lot of people moving from the South to the West. Before the Civil War, so before 1861, Texas was where cattle ranching took place. By cattle ranching, I mean keeping cattle and then obviously killing them and selling the meat. And the main cow which they use, the type of cow, is called the Texas Longhorn. And that's because it could easily survive on the open range. So it could sort of feed itself on the grass of just living free on the Texas grass. Now, throughout the 1850s and 60s, you had something called the beef bonanza, which is where beef was becoming very popular and people wanted to buy it. During the Civil War from 61 to 65, all the soldiers from Texas left to fight either on the Confederate or the Union side. When they returned, they'd left their cows alone. And as what would happen when you leave animals alone with each other is they breed and they produce children. So they come back to a lot more cattle than they left, 5 million cattle. Unfortunately, these are of quite poor quality because they haven't been cared for and haven't been treated right because they've been left alone. So they've got all this cattle which they need to sell, which are of poor quality. Can you make a note for me on these key background points, specifically how the Civil War led to more cattle being produced and what the name of the cattle was? Pause the video and do that now. So make a note in your book. Okay. So some more background. There were 3 problems as a result of this. A reminder that they suddenly had 5 million cows of poor quality as a result of the Civil War. This led to 3 key problems. Problem number 1 is the only way to sell these was to move them on long cattle drives north. So you couldn't sell all your cows down here because there wasn't enough people in this area. You needed to sell it round here, which is where the US was most populated. Obviously, you can't put a cow in a car. You had to drive them and literally walk them all the way there, which would take a number of weeks and months. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is this cattle, the Texas Longhorn, they had a disease called Texas fever, which they carried. Now, it wouldn't kill the Texas Longhorn most of the time, but if it infected another breed of cow, it would infect that other cow and kill them. So these Texas Longhorns are contagious. Finally, you have a third problem. As a result of this Texas fever, homesteaders, specifically in areas such as Kansas, which is here, homesteaders in Kansas and Nebraska, which we know a lot of that was settled in the Homestead Act, they don't want Texas Longhorns coming through their area because they're going to infect their cows and kill them and make them lose money. So they refuse to let the cattle through in fear of Texas fever. So Texas farmers, cattle farmers, had to drive their cows north to sell them, but they weren't allowed to go through Kansas and Nebraska because of this Texas fever, which would infect the other cows. These problems led to the start of the cattle industry in the American West. So the cowboys have to come up with solutions and the cattle ranchers come up with solutions. And 4 gentlemen in particular do come up with those solutions. And that leads the cattle industry really booming in the West in the 1860s. Can you make a note of the 3 problems? And can you write a little sentence to say that these problems lead to the booming of the cattle industry in the West? Pause the video and do that now, please. Just before we move on, there's some evidence I want you to engage with. Now, the first one, source A, is what does this evidence infer about the life of a cowboy? By infer, it means it doesn't tell us explicitly what it means, but it gives us an idea and we need to look at the hints and come up with a conclusion. So this is a drawing or a painting of cowboys. Now, cowboys were the people who would drive the cattle north from Texas into Kansas, and for what reason we'll come on to in a second. When they reached Kansas and they dropped their cows off, they would go into the local cow towns and they would spend all their money, which they were paid for the cattle drive. And they would drink and they would gamble and they would commit crimes. So this evidence, I want you to write down what it infers about the life of a cowboy, specifically when they reach the end of their cattle drive. What must be mentioned, folks, is that cowboys spent very little of their time drinking and in saloons and doing duels at high noon. Most of their time they were driving cattle from Texas to Kansas and that was their job. And when they reach Kansas, they get their money, and then they go and do the sort of cowboy stuff we'd see in John Wayne movies, where they shoot people and they drink and they gamble. But what does this evidence infer about the life of a cowboy? Just one sentence. You can start it. This evidence A infers, and tell me what it infers. Now, evidence B shows a different side to the life of a cowboy. What does this evidence infer about the life of a cowboy? Now, this is very different from this one. It shows what cowboys were doing 90% of the time, which is basically rounding up cattle in Texas to Texas Longhorn and driving them. By drive, I mean walking them north up to Kansas to a cow town. So what does this evidence infer about the life of a cowboy? Pause your video, write a sentence out for me. Apologies, gone too far. So, hopefully you've done that. Now, here is a map of America at this time. I've cut off the top, the northeast, New England, which is not really relevant to our topic. We're doing the American West, which is basically everything. This blue line is the Mississippi, and the Rockies are here. The American West is between the Rockies and the Mississippi. Sort of extends down to the Sierra Nevada as well, and obviously you've got the South. So we're looking at this part of America. Now, I would like you to, in your best possible neatness, in your books, using about a third or a quarter of a page, can you draw out an outline of America? It doesn't need to be perfect, but you've sort of got a relatively straight west coast, then goes fairly flat. You've got a dip for Texas, brings it round a little bit jutting out for Florida. You can round it off because we don't need this bit then, and just bring it up in a flat line on the border of Canada. When you've done that, I want you to label it with the following: the location of gold, which is where the gold bits are; the location of silver, which is where like the grey blue bits are. I want you to label the Chisholm Trail, where the town of Abilene is; the Goodnight Loving Trail, where the railroads were by 1890; the Western Trail, and the Shawnee Trail. The last two aren't that important, but I think it's good to have them anyway. So what I want you to do is sketch out the American borders, the outline of America. You don't need to draw all the individual states in there. But what I want you to do is you might want to trace it over an image of the American, a map using your iPad. And I want you to label those things on the right. I'll be going through them in a second. So pause the video and have a go, please. Right. There's a reason which I'm asking you to show the location of gold. We know that this gold rush here in the Sierra Nevada mountains happened in 1849. It was found at Sutter's Mill. And we know that this was really important, especially because the railroad, which starts here and sort of around Sacramento, the railroad builders of the Central Pacific stopped in the Sierra Nevada to get gold on the way through. However, it wasn't the only gold rush, the 1849 California gold rush. There were two other key ones. One in Colorado, in Denver, which is here, and one in South Dakota in the Black Hills. Now, some of you might remember that the Black Hills are a very sacred area for the Indian Sioux, so a Native American tribe called the Sioux, and that's because it was where they believed they had come from, their birthland. And as part of the Fort Laramie Treaty, these should not have been mined, but of course the white Americans really like gold, so they mine it anyway. So they're the three gold locations you really need: the Sierra Nevada, California one, the Denver in Colorado one, and the Black Hills of South Dakota. Three separate gold rushes. Silver, a bit less important, but you can see it largely correlates with where the railroad goes to, apart from Silver City. The Chisholm Trail we're going to come on to today. That runs up from about Fort Worth in central Texas up to Abilene, which is sort of in northeast Kansas. Very, very important trail, and Abilene, you need to label, is fundamental. You will notice it's on a railroad, and that railroad is connected directly, firstly to Kansas City, but to Chicago. That is crucial. You need to remember that Abilene is connected to Chicago via railroad. It's not the Transcontinental Railroad, which is this one here, which runs from here to here, meets up in Utah. But it's a separate one which sort of breaks off from the Transcontinental around Chicago and links up the south. The Goodnight Loving Trail, similar to the Chisholm Trail, also starts in Texas, a little bit to the west, at Fort Concho. That runs through New Mexico, up through Colorado, where the gold rush is, and stops in Cheyenne, which is just in the Wyoming border, as opposed to Colorado. But again, bang on the Transcontinental Railroad. It stops in Denver, or there's a stop. It doesn't finish, but there's a stop in Denver. Bang on the gold rush and the silver rush of Colorado. They're really, really important. In terms of railroads, there is a northern railroad, not as important. Your key railroads are the Transcontinental, which runs all the way across from California and connects up in Chicago, and also this one, which sort of the two which break off from Chicago. One going through Kansas, Colorado, and Utah, and the other one which sort of bends down through Kansas, goes all the way through New Mexico, Arizona, then comes back round LA back into Arizona, New Mexico, and comes into the south of Texas. This one's less important. This section here is important. Transcontinental and the bit which goes to Kansas. The Western Trail is up here, again, Texas to Nebraska, not massively important, and same goes for the Shawnee Trail, which goes from San Antonio up to Kansas City. So hopefully you've got the key bits labelled, so we've got a visual representation of what's going on in sort of the 1860s. Now, this next bit's going to be me talking quite a lot and you guys making some keynotes. And unfortunately, there's not really any other way for us to do this whilst I'm not in the classroom, but we need to know it. So, in whatever way you want to, you need to break your page into three. Whether you flip your next clean page to landscape and draw 2 lines to break it into thirds, I don't care. You can do 3 separate pages. You need to distinctly mark out 3 separate areas because there are 3 groups of people or three developments we need to discuss. The first one is Joseph McCoy. The second one is Goodnight Loving. And the third one is John Iliffe. So, in however way you've done it, can your first section be entitled, please, Joseph McCoy and Abilene? Do that now, pause the video, mark out your pages or have 3 separate pages, and please entitle it Joseph McCoy and Abilene. Pause the video, do that now. Okay, now, it's important to remember, if you're aiming for a grade 4 to 5 in this, all you need to be able to do is to tell me what Joseph McCoy did, and give me some spend to back it up. If you're going to 6 to 7, you need to be able to explain to me how this leads to the development of the cattle industry and link it to Goodnight Loving and Iliffe. So, we will be doing a timeline at the end of this. I'll just show you. So, after we've been through all 3 of them, and there's the notes, we're going to do a timeline of it. So, as I go through, you may want to pause it and just bullet point some key notes for me. Try not to copy it down because that isn't going to go into your brain at all. You will basically read the words, you will put the words on your page and you'll forget it forever. Try and reword it to something which you can understand. And I'd also recommend that you have a highlighter handy and you highlight any spend. So remember that statistics, places, events, names and dates. And anytime you see any of them, they're highlighted in a colour to make them stand out. So, after the Civil War in 1865, beef was in huge demand in the northern industrial cities. Cattle in the north were worth $40 each. Very, very important statistic. So the beef bonanza happens after the Civil War. Those northern cities we discussed, specifically Chicago and New York, which is over here, they really want beef. They don't have cows just roaming around in Chicago. They will pay $40 per cow to sell the meat onto people in Chicago. However, after the destruction of the Civil War in Texas, the Texas Longhorn, the cattle which we know is raised in Texas, was only worth $5 that had been left to breed and become almost wild. So if you were selling your Texas Longhorn in Texas, you would make $5 because there's so many of them, so there's no real shortage of supply, and they're also quite ill health. They're not in the best shape. However, because of the beef bonanza in Chicago and New York, you could sell them for 8 times the price at $40. So you've got a bit of a problem or a possible solution on your hands if you farm cows in Texas. You need to get your cows from Texas to Chicago to make $40 per cow as opposed to 5. However, let us remember about the issue we have. In 1866, as a year after, some Texas cattlemen decide we're going to take the cattle to the north on a long cattle drive. A cattle drive is where you drive the cows, not in a car, but you walk them up to where you can sell them because they can make 8 times the profit. However, they were stopped from doing this through Kansas as farmers there were worried about the Texas fever. Remember at the start we mentioned the Texas Longhorn had Texas fever and that could infect other cows. All the new homesteaders in Kansas, which is here, they didn't want all the cows from Texas with the Texas fever, coming through Kansas and infecting their cows because they were quite small farmers. They probably just moved over as a result of the Homestead Act of 1862. So they banned cattle drives going through their territory, meaning the cattle farmers can't get to Chicago anymore. However, and this is the key year, 2 things happened in 1867. a new railroad come through a place called Abilene in Kansas, and a guy called Joseph McCoy had the idea to bring the cattle to Abilene, put them on cattle trucks, and send them straight to northern cities like Chicago. So his idea was, after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, or was being built in between 1861 and 1869, the extra tracks were being built to connect up the rest of the country. And it stopped in a place called Abilene in Kansas. And Joseph McCoy decided, if you bring the cows to Abilene, I will provide a town for you where the trains will stop, you can rest, you can put your cows onto the cow train, and they will be moved to Chicago, where your cows will be sold for $40 and not $5. Very clever idea. In addition, in 1867, a year after they had made the ban on Texas longhorn cows with Texas fever going through Kansas, Kansas relaxed its rules about cattle fever, and it started to allow cattle drivers through their state, including the Indian Territory in Kansas. And they would use the Chisholm Trail to do this. So if you had a cow in Texas, you would get them on the Chisholm Trail, like a path, and you would drive them up to Abilene. Abilene was set up, and you would then put your cow on a cow train, and it would be driven to Chicago, where you could sell it for 8 times the profit at $40 instead of $5. Very important in 67 that 1, Joseph McCoy used Abilene to start this, and 2, the Kansas homesteaders relaxed their ban on infected cows going through the state. So, in 1867, Joseph McCoy bought 450 acres of land in Abilene, near the railroad, and he made sure the Chisholm Trail route was clearly marked for the cowboys to reach Abilene. McCoy even built hotels where the cattlemen who owned the cattle and the cowboys who drove the cattle could stay. So he bought 450 acres around here, and he clearly marked out this trail to make them know that this will get you to Abilene, where you can then ship your cows elsewhere. Now this bit's really important. It's a statistic for you. McCoy then spent $5,000 advertising the Chisholm Trail. Riders were sent down to Texas to tell the cattlemen there about Abilene. 3 million cattle were driven along the Chisholm Trail in the 5 years between 67 and 72. So, he built his hotel, 450 acres. He then spent $5,000 advertising and sent riders down to Texas to spread the word. If you get your cows on the Chisholm Trail, it's clearly advertised, get them up to Abilene, put them on the train, stay in a hotel, there'll be bars, you can relax and spend your money as a cowboy, and then your cows can be shipped to Chicago, where they can be sold for much bigger profit. And 3 million cattle between 67 and 72 took this journey and were shipped to Chicago. So between 67 and 72, Abilene became known as the first cow town. Now, in the last lesson we did on Zoom, we did mention how Abilene saw a lot of lawlessness issues, and they had to be solved by Wild Bill Hickok. However, we didn't really get through that as much deal as I'd hoped, so we will have to come back to that another time. But McCoy got very rich, and the cattlemen got more money from their cattle being sold in Chicago as opposed to being sold in Texas. So really, I want you to bullet point the key points of Joseph McCoy and Abilene and highlight any spend for me, please. If you are aiming for a 6 to 7 grade or above, you need to explain how this led to the development of the cattle industry. And you can mention the fact that it increase the profits for cattlemen, as they can now easily ship their cows to a big market in Chicago. Pause the video, make sure you're making your notes in your Joseph McCoy section. Alright, so our next, this one is 2 people. There's 4 people in total. There's McCoy, then the next 2 are a pair, and then there's finally Iliff. But the pair, stage 2, is the Goodnight Loving Trail. Now, if we remember on our map when we drew the Goodnight Loving Trail, it's similar to the Chisholm Trail in that it starts in Texas, but this one goes not up to Kansas, but it sort of goes west and north, up through Colorado into Cheyenne. And the reason for this is the gold rush around here, as we'll come on to. So make sure you set out your next section of where you're going to make your notes as the Goodnight Loving Trail. So, key date. It was created in 1866 by Charles Goodnight, so a year before Joseph McCoy bought the 450 acres at Abilene. Now, Goodnight and Loving had a very, very clever idea. They realised that all the cattle was going to the east, to Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. But they knew there was a market for it. By a market, I don't mean like a literal market with people with stalls. I mean somewhere where you can sell your stuff to people. It's like a term which means you can sell things. So they realised there was a market for cattle in the West. Specifically, around the Navajo Indians, who were close to starvation, and the new mining towns which had been set up. So they knew that instead of doing what everyone was doing and sending their cattle over here, they could go up to here to Colorado, where there was a group of Indians called the Navajo Indians, and they could sell their cattle to them because they were starving as a result of being on reservations and unable to hunt the buffalo. Also, as there was in California, as a result of the gold rush, there was a lot of new mining towns, and the men there needed meat, so they could go and sell their cows there. Goodnight and Loving and 18 of their cowboys drove 2,000 cattle to reach the west, and when they got there, they sold their cattle for 4 times the profit they could compared to Texas. Now, obviously, it's not as much as Chicago, but they're the only ones doing this, so they've sort of cornered the market. So that's in 1866. 2 years later, Goodnight returns to Texas. Loving stays up in the west, and he had some cattle left over. He took a lot more than 2,000, so he had some left over, and he sold them to John Illiff. Now remember his name because he's going to be important. But he sells them to John Illiff, and he sold beef to railroad workers, mining towns, the army, and Indians. There was a massive demand for beef in the west around Colorado and Wyoming. So Goodnight continued to drive cattle to the booming mining towns around the Colorado Gold Rush. So they build this, and he's selling cattle around there. He's driving them from Texas up here, selling them around here to the Indians, to the army, to the gold rushers. And he makes a business deal with John Illiff, and he drove the cattle all the way to the Union Pacific Railroad so the cattle could be transported east or west. So they sort of add a little bit onto it. Instead of just stopping there in Denver, which they did originally, they make a deal with Illiff, and they drive the cattle a bit further to the Transcontinental Railroad, and then they can ship it either to the Gold Rush in the west and the Silver Rush, or they get back to the east as everyone else is doing. It's effectively an alternative to Abilene and the Chisholm Trail. And within 10 years of creating the trail, Goodnight was very sad. Loving had sort of disappeared. He just made it originally. Goodnight is the main guy who continues. And his ranch in Texas, and he bought a lot of land, was 1 million acres. And many others started to use the Goodnight Loving Trail, realizing there's a market not only in the east, but also in the west. And it promoted the cattle industry, not just in the east, but in the west. So, as before, 4 to 5 grades, you need to get down the key points to understand what Goodnight Loving did and highlight any spend. And if you're pushing 4, 8, 6 to 7, you need to explain how this led to the development of the cattle industry. Think about what it did for the Western cattle industry. And you're going to have to draw a link in a second between this guy and John Illiff, but also think, how do these link to Joseph McCoy? Think about what Joseph McCoy has done and what these do in comparison, or what do they do as a result of it. So pause, make your notes, and if you're a 6 to 7, explain how this leads to the development of the cattle industry. Alright, you'll be pleased to know this is the last one. John Illiff. So stage 3, if you're area 3, whatever you've done in your book, can you write John Illiff and ranching? As said before, your books will be taken in when I'm back, and if stuff has not been completed up to the expected standard, then you can expect to be with me after school, and we will catch up in full at that time. However, let's go through John Illiff, same process as before. 4 and 5, know what he did. 6 and 7, explain how it led to the development of the cattle industry. So, in 1861, John Illiff bought a herd of cattle for a reduced price as the cattle were thin and exhausted after a long drive. In the same year, gold had been discovered in the Indian Territory of Colorado, in Denver. The city was Denver and it was in Colorado, meaning new towns were growing rapidly full of gold prospectors, people looking for gold. There was a huge demand for meat. So, forgot to mention before, it's very important, this gold rush happens in 1861. So that's 1849, and the Denver, Colorado one is 1861. We return to Illiff. So unfortunately, although there was a massive market, Illiff could not get cattle to begin with, as there was no railroad to Denver until 1871. So the Transcontinental Railroad was built up here to Cheyenne. This extension to it was not built until 1871, so we couldn't get enough cattle to sell around here. Now the good news is, we can link this to Goodnight Loving, because in 68 they sold some cattle to him to get him going. So his answer to this problem changed the cattle industry. And he had a problem that he couldn't get cows from here to where he wanted to sell them because there was no railroad. So he changed the way the cattle industry was done forever. I've gone too far, I apologise. So rather than bring them up in Texas and then drive them to Colorado in the west, he would breed them and fatten them up on the grass of the open plains in the west already, instead of having to move them from Texas. Now this had some advantages. No, the advantage number one is he would not have to pay for the transport, as he wouldn't have to move them, wouldn't have to have cowboys to move them up. And he could then even make more profit as he could get land as a result of the Homestead Act, which is what he did in 1862 and onwards. He bought loads and loads of land out of the Homestead Act for really cheap. And the grass was free, so he didn't need to buy any food for his cows. In 1866, he bought land near Denver, and by 1870, he had 26,000 cattle. And he bought that land using the Homestead Act, and he claimed even more land. Iliff became Denver's first ever millionaire. And by 1872, he then was able to supply new mining towns, the railroad workers of the Pacific Union Railroad, and the government. So, as a result of him building this open plains and bringing cattle up here, he could sell to the mining towns, which were in there, the Navajo Indians, who were on reservations everywhere, and also the railroad workers who were working on these two railroads. So, he suddenly had a massive market to sell his meat. And importantly, this is really important if you're going to explain how this led to the development of the cattle industry. This was the first time where cattle had been ranched on the open plains of the Great Plains rather than driven from the south. So never before had people not driven cattle from Texas and just brought them up in the west. Excuse me. I was preparing that sneeze for quite a while. I apologise. So, They drove them up from the north. Usually they drive them up from the north on Goodnight, Loving or Chisholm, and Iliff would just bring them up in the west and would sell them there, which saved him a lot of money, and it really sparked a new trend in the cattle industry. Now, we had a beef bonanza in the east after the Civil War. This reaches the west by the 1870s because there's now low costs because you can just keep your cows there, and there's loads of money to be made because people are desperate for meat in the mining towns and the Indians and the railroad workers. So investors poured money into the cattle ranching industry, and a few men became what's called cattle barons, where they have loads of control and influence over the town's politics and even the law because they're that rich. They've made that much money off cows, bringing them up on the open range in the west, that they've become really rich and powerful. So key points, you've got McCoy, who makes the cow town of Abilene, where you can drive your cows from Texas up the Chisholm Trail, put them on a cow train and sell them to Chicago. You then got Goodnight Loving, who go, as a result, they want to find a different market. They go another way through Texas up to Denver and Colorado and sell their cattle there. And they also sell some cattle to John Iliff, and he's the first one to open range his cattle to keep them on the open plains and sell them for a much bigger profit to the Indians, the Navajo Indians, the government workers, and the to the railroad workers. And if you want to, you can screenshot this, and this is just the key information summarised on a little sheet. Hopefully you should have very similar in your book. And as all the years and key terms are in black or are red and underlined or bolded, you need to ensure you've done the same to all your spend you've written down with a highlighter, please. I apologise for the slight formatting error, but on your next clean page, you need to ensure you've rotated your book to landscape and you've drawn a timeline down the middle, starting in 1860 and then finishing in 1876. And what I would like you to do is go through all your notes and add any key events you can see onto the timeline. Now, if I was to give you some advice, you would do McCoy in one colour, Goodnight Loving in another, and Iliff in a third colour. So you might want to do black, blue, and green, or whatever colours you may have. If you don't have three colours, you may want to highlight stuff or give a little key. So you've got like the yellow and the blue and the green, and you're colouring in each one or doing a little mark next to each one. If you really want to be secure in 6, 7, and grade 8 even, you will neatly draw links between one event and how it leads to somebody else. So can you draw a link between something Goodnight Loving did and something John Iliff did, or something Joseph McCoy did and something that Goodnight Loving did? Make sure you get the chronology right. Please set it out neatly. This is a very, very important task. It should take you a bit of time. So pause the video, please, and have a go at that. If you finish that, folks, there is a final task I would like you to complete. I would like you to write what's called a narrative account analysing the key stages in the growth of the cattle ranching in the years 1861 to 72. You may use the following in your answer: Joseph McCoy and Abilene, cattle barons. You may also use information of your own. Basically, you need to write me the 3 stages of development like a story. But the important thing I want you to do is to analyse how it links to one another, how each event. So you've got to use these linking phrases. You have to. This resulted in, this led to, this meant. So you'll start with cattle ranching began with, then you'll do the first event of the growth of cattle ranching. And you'll end it with this finally resulted in a huge growth of cattle ranching in America West. You can just do 1 paragraph for this, but it needs to be set out so there's 3 parts to it. Now, key tips, you need to do it in chronological order. You must explain how one event leads to another. And you must include accurate, specific factual knowledge, aka spend. And how did your events lead to the outcome of cattle ranching? So please, please use those terms as much as you can. Now, have a go at them. There is the literacy grid stuck in the front page of your book. The inside cover. Please use that as a structure. When you've done that, we've completed today's lesson. Thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging. I will be checking your work next time I'm in, and hopefully this has been beneficial to you. Thank you very much.